Well, I didn't fall, so that's a good start. I grew up in a divided household. My father was somewhere between atheist and agnostic, whereas my mother is a very devout and oftentimes zealous Christian. So growing up, I never doubted that God existed. And I was brought up to believe that the church is a safe place. Unfortunately, that hasn't always been my experience. Now, growing up, my dad was a mining engineer, which meant we moved around a lot. In fact, by my 13th birthday, we had moved 12 times. And for reasons no one understands, we settled in Georgia. Very small town in Georgia. And so when I started 8th grade, I was in a class with kids who had been in the same class together since Lamaze. They weren't exactly open and accepting of new kids, especially new kids who were a little bit weird and strange and didn't fit in. Now, for reasons I don't really truly understand, when I was 13 is when the mental illness side of things really started to surface. And I think part of that was because I started to really recognize just how different I was from all of my peers. That no matter how hard I tried to be like everybody else, I just always came up short. I was getting bullied nonstop, at school, at home, and even at the church. But the church was supposed to be a safe place, right? And so when I started acting out, my mom took me to the church and said, hey, I need you to fix her. Didn't work. But I went to the church expecting that safe place. And the more I got picked on, and the more I got bullied, and the more I was just struggling with everything, I found solace through self-harm. Now, initially, this was just introducing my fist to trees and brick walls, anything that it wasn't going to get hurt so that I didn't get into trouble. And then from there, I started cutting because it gave me a sense of control. It gave me a way to cope. It gave me a way to handle all these feelings and emotions that I couldn't express and I didn't know what to do with. It was also around that time that I started seriously thinking about ending my own life because I just didn't see any way out. And I went to my youth pastor. He was a great guy, and I trusted him a lot. And I struggled because I so badly wanted to tell him, but I couldn't. Because I was afraid of what would happen, and I did not want to get in trouble. And I had my first attempts at that time. They were not considered legitimate attempts because they weren't significant enough to actually require intervention. Now later, when I went to college, I came home, was having kind of a hard time adjusting, and I went to one of the local churches. You live in Georgia, there's a church on every corner. So it wasn't that hard to walk from my house to the church. And I walked in the building, and there was this huge auditorium full of people, and it was loud, and it was noisy, and all the sensory stuff was just way too much. So I stood outside, just like you would hear, in the lobby, leaning against a wall so I could hear the message. And I wasn't paying attention and just kind of shut down a little bit. And a gentleman came up and tapped me on the shoulder, and I just froze and freaked out. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground, and there's all these 2,000 people, although Beth would probably say it was 2. I'm pretty sure it was at least 20. And they're pushing me down on the ground so that I don't hurt myself. I guess they decided to go ahead and do it for me. And they're speaking in this weird language, and I'm fighting, and I'm trying to get up, and they're trying to get demons out of me. And I'm like, no, we're good. Please leave them. We're good friends. The church was supposed to be a safe place. And yet here I am feeling conflicted and like I'm done something wrong and I'm in trouble. And thankfully I got out of there and I went on. A few years later I graduated from college. And I found myself living in Colorado. Not in the greatest way to end up there. And I went through some struggles. And then I moved and I was living with some family. Still not really sure what happened, but I got invited to live in my mobile home for the second time. It sounds better than sleeping in my car. And I reached out that night and I called my mom. I was like, Mom, I don't know what to do. I'm scared and I'm so confused. And her response was to give me a list of Bible verses. And I'm like, okay, that's great. What am I supposed to do with this? So the next morning, I went to one of the big churches in town, and I went, and I was shaking, and I was scared, and I was nervous, and I was sleep deprived, and I went to open the door, and I was shaking, and I got myself in. And I could barely talk, and I just went up to them, and I was like, help. And they're like, what's going on? And I talked to them. I was like, look, I don't have a place to live. I'm sleeping in my car. My mom gave me these verses, but I don't understand them. I don't know what to do with them. So they set me up with a table in the front lobby, and I sat with my Bible, and I studied through these. And over the next few months, they gave me a safe place to stay during the day, and I could study, and I started to develop a relationship with some of the staff and some of the pastors. Now, eventually, a few months later, was able to find a place to live. I ended up moving into the apartment the day before my grandfather's memorial. And so when my grandfather died, they wrapped me in love and comfort. I don't process things well, especially when it comes to emotions. And so the grief didn't hit me initially. And so they were expecting me to be grieving at that point, and they did what anybody would do. They would support you, and they would show you love and kindness. The problem was, about 6 months later, the loss finally started to sink in. And not knowing what to do, I fell back on old coping skills and started cutting again. And for reasons I can't truly explain, one night I went into the church after cutting, and they were very superficial, barely scratches, but there were fresh cuts on my forearm. And I walked in to talk to the pastor, and they saw the scratches on my arm, called paramedics, sent me to the psych hospital. Okay. Next morning, I tried to reach out and call because I just needed somebody to talk to. I was looking for that comfort. And I was informed that the pastors were no longer available to me, and I was no longer welcome at that church. About 6 months later, I went across the highway to the other big church because I was trying to find a place where I could belong. And because of what had happened at the first church, I was informed that I was not welcome at their church. If I did not leave, I would be arrested. I left. Don't really like handcuffs. They're kind of uncomfortable. Now, this was in 2007, 2008. Well, in December of 2008, my sister surprised me. See, I've always loved dogs. And she reached out to me around Thanksgiving and said, hey, are you still looking for a puppy? And I was like, oh, yeah, definitely. A friend of hers had just had a litter of rat terriers. And so when I came home for Christmas, I got the pick of the litter. It's funny because I accidentally picked the wrong one. When I went to pick him up, and he started like chewing on my leg, and his brother I'm holding is like shaking him because they look too much alike. And that was little T-Bone, Tiberius Bones. He needed a tough name. He was a small dog and huge Star Trek fan, so there you go. Now, T-Bone was awesome. And we went back out to Colorado, and having a dog helped ease some of that isolation that I was feeling. And it helped ease some of the loneliness and the homesickness because I was truly homesick. And I wanted to go back home, but it wasn't time for me to come back to Georgia. My family made that very clear that I needed to stay in Colorado and figure things out. And if I was going to move home, I needed to do it the right way. Unfortunately, T-Bone's life was very short-lived. At the beginning of 2010, he started getting sick. And I would take him to the vet. Vet couldn't figure out what was going on. And I had missed Christmas 2009, which was my nephew's first Christmas, because I couldn't get off work. So we went home in March. I got to meet my nephew, who was 4.5 months old, and T-Bone was still getting sick. So my mom encouraged me to take him to our family vet there, which turned out to be a huge blessing. The vet discovered that he had had a bowel obstruction that had perforated. And by the time they opened him up, there was 4 inches of necrotic bowel. He survived. He got to come home. And he was back to his happy self. And before we left Georgia, he made sure that we had an accredited vet and somebody that I could trust to continue his care when we went back to Colorado. But like I said, his life was short-lived. It was only a few months later that T-Bone got really sick. He started throwing up one night, and I took him to the vet first thing the next morning, fearing he had another obstruction, only to find out that he had pancreatitis. And the vet would not tell me that he was going to be okay, and I begged God. I said, please, God, please, I can't lose him. Don't take him from me. On June 12th, I worked a double shift at work. And I had a break between shifts, and I went to go see him. And the vet let me go back to the kennel area, and they opened the cage, and T-Bone crawled out in my lap. And even though he was heavily medicated, I could tell he was in a lot of pain. And I looked at him, and I was like, buddy, it's okay. I don't want you to suffer. If this is too much, you can let go. And then he crawled back into his cage and went back to sleep, and I headed back to work. That night, I was sitting on my couch at home and watching TV, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the song lyrics started playing in a loop. How will I live without you? How will I breathe without you? And I knew, without knowing, that something was wrong. And so I got dressed and I drove to the local mental health crisis center because I had nowhere else to turn. And when I got there, I knocked on the door, and the first gentleman came out, didn't know me, but he could recognize something was wrong. But in that state, I could not physically speak. When I get really upset, all the muscles will clench up, and I stutter so bad that it physically hurts to speak. And he recognized the anguish in my face, and he could tell something was wrong. He was trying to get me to open up. Unfortunately, his coworker, who was a supervisor, came out. And we had a relationship that made oil and water look really compatible. And so she sent him back inside, turned to me and said, Heather, we do not have time for your games tonight. Just go home. And then turned around and walked inside. And so that's what I did. I went home and I crawled into bed. And the only reason I know I fell asleep is because the phone call the next morning woke me up. June 13th, 2010. Sunday morning, 8 o'clock. The vet called. And even before I answered the phone, I knew that T-Bone was gone. And the vet let me come in so that I could say goodbye. And I took his baby blanket and I wrapped him in it, and I handed him back over to the vet after I had cried as much as I could cry, and I was done. And in that moment, as I handed it over, I knew exactly what I had to do. So I went home, and I went into my cupboard, and I grabbed a bottle of Klonopin and a bottle of Flexerol and the single random beer that was in my refrigerator, to this day, not sure why, because I don't drink. Swallowed them all, left my phone on my kitchen table, went downstairs, got in my car, and started to drive towards the river trail where we used to hike together. But at the last minute, God intervened, and somehow my car went this way. And I found myself in the parking lot of PetSmart. PetSmart was T-Bone's favorite place in the world, and the managers there loved him almost as much as I did. And she saw me standing out there and had one of her coworkers call 911, and that is what saved my life. Now see, in my mind, I was perfectly coherent when I said, here's my keys, here's my wallet, please clean out the apartment so my parents don't have to, I'm gonna go die now. Apparently what actually happened is I garbled and then fell. I was transported to the hospital where I spent 2 days in the ICU on a ventilator before being transported to the psych hospital. I would spend the next 4 months in and out of that psych hospital trying desperately to express what was going on and express my pain and share with them how devastated I was, but most people were like it was just a dog. They did not understand that that was my breaking point. And I didn't have a strong support system to fall back on, and I didn't have a church family to call home. Now, thankfully, a few months later, Maximus Moot, translates to greatest courage, came into my life, and he was a little bundle of joy. He was my why. He was my everything. About a year after that, we were finally able to move back home to Georgia. And while that was not always a great situation, I was at least back with my family. And when I first moved back to Georgia, I sought out trying to find a new church home because I wanted to attempt to make friends. I wanted to find a community that I could be a part of. I couldn't. And so after a few months, I just gave up and I was like, okay, well, I guess God's done with me, so I'm done with him. And I got really angry and really frustrated for a very long time. And then about 7 years ago, I was at a local community event, movie night at the local park. And they had all these different booths set up, and there was a Papa John's food truck and a booth next to it that happened to be for a church. Did not know this. So I went over to get a piece of pizza, somehow started talking to the pastor. He handed me his card. I walked away with the card, but not the pizza. Go figure. Over the next few months, I would reach out to him and talk to him, especially when things were starting to get hard and difficult. And he never really introduced himself to me as a pastor. Like, it was on his card that he was, but he was just Larry. Although I would call him Sir or Pastor Larry because it didn't feel right to just call him Larry. And then something weird happened. Over the course of the next few months, I would just randomly, sporadically reach out to him, and he always answered the phone. And it didn't matter how angry I was at God, he did not turn me away. Eventually, he convinced me to come check out his church. Now, let me explain something to you. His church is tiny. We may have 20 people in the entire church, and it's getting too big for me now. And back then, it was a little bit bigger. And so he still teases me about this. I would walk in and then immediately run and back out the door. And I did this quite a while. And then eventually, I would walk in and I would go and I would sit and then immediately jump up and walk out. Eventually, I finally started staying for the service. They have a game night every month. He invited me to game night, so I came because I like to play board games. And we started to develop a relationship. 2020, everybody's favorite year, right? Yeah, mine too. I had finally started to feel like I had a home, and I had started to develop a routine, and I was struggling with a lot of the mental health stuff, but at least I had a routine, and I finally had the church family, and I was really engaged, and then COVID said, yeah, just kidding, and it all went away. I lost the women's Bible study. I lost going to church on Sunday. I ended up losing Toastmasters, which was a huge part of my life. I lost Dragon Con, which if you're not familiar with it is Geek Mecca. All within like a couple of weeks. And it was just so completely devastating and isolating. And I had just finally started to recognize the importance of actually being around people and connecting. But he gave me the opportunity, because we were filming the online service, to come and at least meet with him once a week to film the service so that I still had that connection. 2020 was a hard year, especially towards the end. In October of 2020, I had a really nasty asthma attack, ended up in the hospital. Got out of the hospital a week later, ended up back in the hospital with COVID. Got out of the hospital a week after my father passed. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't process grief well, and all the isolation of having to quarantine just intensified that. So in 2021, I was still struggling, and I had fallen back on cutting. And here was the key thing, that really made a difference for me. It has been about a year and 4 months, 5 months now since I last cut. And the main reason that I was able to achieve that is because they knew and never condemned me for it. They didn't condone the behavior, but they walked alongside me with it. They introduced me to a doctor who got it, and she said, hey, if you're gonna do it, be safe, no stitches. In fact, the last night that I cut, she came out to prevent me from being sent to the hospital. And then in the course of talking, decided why not have an asthma attack, which Ended up at the emergency room, and they were going to place me on a hold had she not been there. They ended up letting me go because of the relationship that we had. And part of the reason that they were going to do that was a month before that had been the anniversary of my father's passing. And on that day, my pastors took me to the graveside, and it was the first time I'd been to my father's grave. And while I was there, something just snapped inside of me, and all the old thoughts started coming up. And I didn't have to tell them I was suicidal. I didn't even recognize that was what was going on until I told them they could leave. And they're like, "No, nice try though." And they didn't try to force me to go to the hospital. They simply sat with me until I agreed to go. And by the time I agreed to go, the suicidal thoughts had calmed down, and it was more about just wanting to cut to regain control. So having that happen a month before and then ending up in the hospital with fresh cuts, it was God intervening to keep me out of the psych hospital. Now, I mentioned Max earlier, right? He was my why, he was my everything. We lost him. He was diagnosed with cancer on December 6th. It was too far gone. I was told that we would have a few months. Unfortunately, the mobile vet came out on the 10th and went ahead and helped him cross over because there was nothing we could do, and I wasn't going to let him suffer. And unlike T-Bone, I got to hold him and cradle him and comfort him. And after he was gone, I didn't know what to do. So I went out for our daily walk, and then I found myself on the doorstep of my pastor's house, and he just sat me down. He didn't say anything. We just sat in silence until I was ready to speak. Because he had showed me that the church really is a safe place. Now see, here's the thing, and this is really important. It is far past time that we start talking openly about suicide and self-harm, and stop condemning people and stop treating people like they are criminals or that they're selfish or that they're cowardly for fighting a battle within their own minds. We need to start walking alongside them. Even if it's not your story, you can still walk beside them, listen to them, give them a safe place to talk about this stuff. There are plenty of resources out there for you if you need them. NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, is a great resource. There's another resource called BeTheOne2.com. Or you can always reach out to me, and I would be happy to come and share my story with your church. Oh, thank you.